And it happened after these things that Elohim did try Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, behold, here I am. And he said, take now your Yachid, Yitzhak, whom you love, and get into the land of Moriah and offer him there as an ascending smoke offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell you of. Now, this passage, of course, presents, I think, one of the most difficult concepts in all of Scripture. The idea that Yah is calling Abraham to human sacrifice, and not only to human sacrifice, but he's calling him to the sacrifice of his beloved son, the one that they had waited for from the promise of Yah for years and years and years. And suddenly he's being called to sacrifice him as an ascending smoke offering. So we're going to deal with a couple of words here that are important to the Cepher, because the Cepher uses the term Yachid here to describe Yitzhak. And we also use the phrase ascending smoke offering rather than a burnt offering or that kind of a sacrifice. And we're going to talk about both those words as how they appear in the Ivrit, because, of course, they're critical to understanding this passage. Now, when we talk about the idea of the Yachid, we see here that typically it is written that take now your son, your only begotten son, Yitzhak, whom you love, and get thee into the land of Moriah and offer him, right, as a burnt offering. Well, the difficulty with the statement, your only begotten son, is that Abraham had another son, Yishmael. And when we look at this idea of the word begotten, this is a word that is a past tense form of the word begat. And we see the word begat used excessively in English texts. It no longer appears in the Cepher, the word begat, as we've replaced it with the word fathered. And it's quite interesting that you see begat or begotten being used here, because you are talking about Abraham's sire, if you will, siring of his son Yitzhak. But the word that is found there in the Ivrit is not only begotten son, it is the word Yachid. Now, Strong's will tell us that Yachid means united, i.e., soul or alone. By implication, beloved, also lonely, as a life not to be replaced, a darling, an only child, or solitary. Well, the solitary and the onlyness aspect of this really comes from this singular word that is quite close in its root, which is the word yakad. And yakad is the primitive root, and it's a verb of the word yachid. Now, when you look at the idea of yachid or yakad, this means to become one, to join, or to unite. Well, we can see that this is kind of a combination word, in my opinion, of both the word Yah, Yod He, and the word Echad, one. You might recall the Shema Yasharel, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. Yachad is a word that we use in John chapter 17, when Mashiach is discussing the unity of the Father with the Son and how it is his prayer that we might be united with the Father in Yakad, as joined or united as to become one. Yachid is the noun form of the word Yakad, and you often see this in the Hebrew, where the verb spelled Yod He Dalet, Yod Chet Dalet, is going to be replaced or transformed by the adding of a Yod or a Vav into the word to create the noun. So the noun becomes Yachid, and so Yachid has an implication of united or joined, right? So the implication is not rather that it is one, or soul or alone, but rather that it is united. So the Yaqid is the one closest to, the one united to the Father. And this is why the term beloved is a better discussion of the word Yaqid than is the idea of only begotten. Because only begotten then creates a contradiction for us when we see that Abraham had pleaded for his son Ishmael to be the one with the blessing. And he did not, he was not the one that was going to be the heir of the promise. Yitzhak would be the heir of the promise. Ishmael is blessed, but is not the heir of the promise. Okay, so important aspect about the term Yaqid, and this is why we use the word Yaqid in this passage rather than only begotten. Now we see also when we talk about the only begotten Son of Yahweh in the New Testament in reference to Mashiach, this is a reference that is going to come back to the idea of Yitzhak, and yet for the same reason, we elected to use the word Yaqid in describing Mashiach in the Gospels rather than only begotten. And again, this idea of only begotten would create a huge confusion inside the emerging church in the early centuries of the church because of the doctrine of Arianism. And the doctrine of Arianism would be dealing with the idea that the Mashiach was begotten and did not exist before being begat. And so again, a little bit of sloppiness in the phraseology and in the understanding creates confusion in the ears of the hearer. Now, when we talk about the idea of burnt offering that is used here, in the Cepher, we use the phrase ascending smoke offering, where the Hebrew term olah is found. Now, when we talk about olah, that's a very interesting pronunciation. That's a Masoretic pronunciation, using the cholim to signify the ayin lamed he in the spelling. And sometimes it's also spelled ayin vav lamed he, which gives further evidence to it being an olah rather than an olah. However, this is a very interesting word. Typically, the ayin is pronounced as either a schwa, Allah, or even an elah, like Ehud Barak, for instance. It's a name spelled with an ayin. And also in the name Esu, where we see these ayin, shin, vav, Esu, it's, you might say you could be pronounced Asu, but no one pronounces it Osu. But yet we see this idea of identifying this with an O. Now, part of the reason that that is being done is because this comes from the root Allah, or in the Ivrit pronunciation, Allah, because again, it having the vowel sound of ah at the end, its pronunciation will be centered on the ultimate syllable and not the penultimate syllable, as in Derek or Melech, but rather Allah. And this is the primitive root of this word meaning burnt offering, or as we put it in the Cepher, ascending smoke offering. Why do we call it an ascending smoke offering? Because it literally means to ascend. The primitive root, Allah, means to ascend. Intransitively, to be high, or actively to mount up, used in a great variety of senses, primary and secondary, literally and figurative, to arise up, to cause to ascend, to break the day, to bring up, to cause to burn. That's an implication of it. To carry up, to cast up, to climb up. Now, one of the verbs that is found from the word Allah, this ayin lamed he, is the word aliyah, which is ayin lamed yod he, again creating a noun from the verb. And in creating that noun, we see the idea of ascending. So when people would today, now in the modern world, if you were to go to Israel and say, I want to become an Israeli citizen, you would be making aliyah. That is to say, you would be ascending up to the status of an Israeli citizen, aliyah. And this is the primitive root of this word that is mispronounced as olah. And the olah means a step or stairs ascending, usually a holocaust. Now, this is the phrase used in Strong's to describe this burnt offering, a holocaust. Now, so this passage could read, you get into the land of Moriah and offer him there as a holocaust upon one of the mountains, which I will tell you of. So here we see a very difficult passage. This passage is going to be explained, I think, explained quite well in the book of Yashar that we will deal with when we get to those commentaries. But it is definitely well explained as to whose idea this was and how it came about and its implications. But let's deal with some of the implications a little bit more, because we talked about this in our previous discussion of the earlier chapters and Sarah's pregnancy, that we see something here that potentially could be the hand of Yah working. I think it is the hand of Yah working, where he has said, okay, Sarah is completely incapable of having children, and Abraham is, as they put it in the scriptures, dead, yet Abraham is capable now of getting Sarah pregnant. Well, this can only happen because she has a miraculous ovum in her womb. There's a miraculous ovum in her womb. Now, this is going to be something that you could call immaculate conception. Well, not immaculate conception, but let's call it a supernatural conception. Let's call it a divine conception. In other words, the ability of Sarah to have the child was created by the miracle of Yah, who created something new in her. Now, there's something new in her. This ovum that is created in Sarah is something that is devoid of and has no of the mtDNA residual from Eve, from Hua. So or from Naamah, for that matter. So whatever the sins were that were collectively contributing to the mtDNA of Sarah at this point, these are going to be non-existent. This is not going to be an MDA passage from Sarah to this ovum. This ovum is miraculous. It has a new and a fresh mtDNA that is going to be blended with the Y-DNA of Abraham. Now, the Y-DNA of Abraham, although Abraham was considered righteous because of his belief and his obedience, this does not necessarily mean that he was appropriate for the disposition of mankind, to be the blood offering that is going to redeem all of mankind. And even though I think that there was a point where Yahweh considered it because of the miraculous nature of the embryo in Sarah. But we get this precursor, we get this idea of what? We can see here that the blood sacrifice that is going to be required to redeem fallen away man is something that is contemplated from the beginning, but Yah has contemplated from the beginning what? He has contemplated that he himself would give himself as a lamb. But there is a demonstration here to Abraham and to the children of the promise of Abraham, what kind of disposition is going to take place for Yah to make himself manifest in the flesh, to tabernacle among us, only to be put to death, and to get some idea of the drama that is involved in that, of the tragedy that is involved in that of the epic loss that's involved in that, is going to be demonstrated in this push towards Abraham's obedience. Now, in addition to that, we also see something in this obedience that is kind of interesting as well, which is that you see this push towards something that Yah is saying, I'm going to push you towards this human sacrifice, but it's going to be prevented at the last moment. And this tells you something about the human condition too, that oftentimes we're pushed towards a disposition where we should not be going, but we stop ourselves. And in stopping ourselves, we do not sin. All right, at least that's my take on what this representation is in this passage. All right, let's continue. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took two of his young men with him and Et Yitzchak, his son, and clave the wood for the ascending smoke offering, and rose up and went to the place of which Elohim had told him. Okay, now when we use the word et here, this is the Aleph Tav signifying Yitzchak, and Well, you'll find this throughout the Cepher, that this Aleph Tav is found in this passage. And it signifies that the divine authority of Yah is on this particular aspect of the life of Yitzchak. Not all of Yitzchak, because there'll be many times that Yitzchak will be mentioned without the et. But in this case, he is the divine object of the point of this sentence. Okay. Then on the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place from afar off. So it took them 3 days' journey to get there from where they were, 3 days' journey. And even then, he saw the place from afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, "Abide you here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the ascending smoke offering and laid it upon Yitzchak, his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they both went together. And Yitzchak spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for an ascending smoke offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, Elohim will provide himself a lamb for an ascending smoke offering." Now, in this particular case, we can see that Abraham is thinking, well, Yitzchak is the lamb of Elohim. This is what he's thinking. And we're going to see later that, in fact, when Yochanan the Baptist, the immerser, sees Yahusha, he says, "Behold the Lamb of Elohim, who takes away the sins of the world." So the statement made by Yochanan, the immerser, right off the bat, is telling you that Mashiach, that Yahusha, is going to be a human offering. And Abraham said, "My son, Elohim will provide himself a lamb for an ascending smoke offering." And so the forecast is made. So they went, both of them together, and they came to the place which Elohim had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there that would be out of unhewn stone, and laid the wood in order, and bound Yitzchak his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Now, I must say that at one point, I thought we might have found this situs in South Africa at a place called Adam's Calendar. There appeared to be a stone, uncut stone, that was the size of a human being, where you could lay down and look out over this valley. Maybe this was Mount Moriah. Maybe this was a recreation of Mount Moriah by someone who later arrived there, because of the magnetic properties of the stones at that place. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the messenger of Yahweh called to him out of the heavens and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Lay not your hand upon the lad, neither do you anything to him. For now I know that you fear Elohim, seeing you have not withheld your son, your Yachid, from me." Now this was a messenger from heaven that was saying this to him, an angel, a malach. And Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him for an ascending smoke offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Yahweh Yireh, as it is said to this day, "In the mount of Yahweh it shall be seen." Now, when we talk about this, was the sacrifice of the ram required? No, the messenger did not say, "Oh, by the way, here's a ram, go ahead and sacrifice it." He said that your faith has been tested and is complete. We know that you fear Yahweh. There is nothing more to say. There is nothing more to do. You're done. Abraham spots a ram and says, "Oh, let's sacrifice that." Now, at this point, what is Yitzchak's thinking? He's lying on the altar, being prepared to have his throat slit and to be burned in a fire, waiting. And then, of course, we hear this message, and Abraham sees this ram and sacrifices it instead. Okay. And the messenger of Yahweh called to Abraham out of the heavens the second time and said, "By myself I have sworn 7 oaths, says Yahweh. For because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your Yachid, that in blessing I will bless you, and in multiplying I will multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. And so Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose up and went together to Bere'shiyth, that is the well of the oath, and Abraham dwelt at Bere'shiyth. Now we know that Bere'shiyth must have been at least a 3-day walking journey from Mount Moriah, where the sacrifice was going to be. It was at least a 3-day journey to this mountain by foot, right? Or as fast as the ass could travel, but they're traveling by foot. And we also know here something that is very interesting in this passage, because there is an instruction here, shall possess the gate of his enemies. This is a strategy that is used in controlling societies really all over the world, is to control the gates of entry. Now, we see the gates of entry controlled, for instance, in the United States at some very critical places. Human resource departments, those are gates. Those are gates to employment in corporations. Those gates are controlled. College entry requirements, those gates are controlled. U.S. military entry requirements, those gates are controlled. Entry into the pop culture scene, whether you're talking about music or you're talking about film or you're talking about books or whatever is used in the pop culture, those gates are also controlled. So by controlling those gates, you can assure and ensure who is going to enter and who is going to be forbidden entry. And so by forbidding entry to non-desirables, you can control the culture. So this is a very strategic aspect of cultural control, to control and possess the gate of your enemies. And it happened after these things that it was told to Abraham, saying, behold, Milcah, she has also borne children to your brother Nahor, who's his firstborn, and Buz his brother, and Kemuel, the father of Aram, and Kesed, and Chatzo, and Pildash, and Yidlaf, and Bethuel. And Bethuel fathered Rivkah, and these 8 Milcah did bear to Nahor, Abraham's brother. And his concubine, whose name was Reumah, she bore also Tiva, Gaham, Thahash, and Ma'akah. Now, it's important to see here at this point that Nahor has 12 children ahead of Abraham, who only has Yishmael and Yitzhak. His brother already has 12 children. And some of these names are going to be important. You can see Aram here, and you can see Kesed here. And Kesed may also be linked to, and again, the progenitor of, remember that Nahor and Abraham are of the house of Arav Kesed. And because they're of that house of Arav Kesed, they become known as the Kasdim. Now here is Kesed named after Arav Kesed, and this would be the progenitor of the Kasdim. The Kasdim would build Nineveh. The Kasdim would build Babylon. Babylon is called the excellency of the Kasdim. And we would also see that these Kasdim would, once the migration began, which didn't really begin until we get into the later dates, we start to see we start to see motion of the Kasdim into the Hittite Empire, and from the Hittite Empire, they also began to move into Central Europe. And as they did, the Kasdim became known as the Kasdi, or the Chaldeans, the Chaldee, and the Chaldee became known as the Celti, or the Celtic people who were dominant in Central Europe. Namely, you're talking about Poland, Slovakia, Czechia, Austria, Slovenia, Croatia, in those areas. These, and Germany, this is where a lot of the Celtic people would go. Now, what about this last child born to the concubine, Reumah, whose name was Maacah? This is going to be the father of the tribe that is later going to call themselves Maccabee. Okay, let's continue with chapter 23. And Sarah was 127 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, the same as Hebron in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Now, you can see that the discussion we get in Bere'shiyth here is a very limited discussion. Sarah waits her whole life to have a child. When the child gets to a certain age, Abraham takes him away to take him out and sacrifice him. It doesn't say here whether or not that she knew that Abraham had not been sacrificed. She didn't know that. But we see that immediately after these events happen, Sarah dies. Now, the book of Jasher gives us a very elaborate discussion about what takes place during this period of time and the visitation of Hasatan in the life of Sarah, accusing, denouncing, of course, lying, deceiving. And these all contributed to her death. And we can also see that she's in Kiryat Arba, which, again, Kiryat is kind of the city of Arba, and it's called Hebron or Chevron. You see it spelled in the Cepher, but it's pronounced Hebron. And we know it in the modern world as Hebron. And this is in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah. Remember, he was at Beersheba. He was not at Hebron. And Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Het, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I might bury my dead out of my sight. And the children of Het answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my Adonai, you are a mighty prince among us. In the choice of our sepulchres, bury your dead. None of us shall withhold from you his sepulchre, but that you may bury your dead. And Abraham stood up and bowed to the people of the land, even to the children of Het. And he communicated with them, saying, If it is your mind that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me to Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he has, which is in the end of his field. For as much money as it is worth, he shall give it to me for a possession of a burying place amongst you. And Ephron dwelt among the children of Het, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the audience of the children of Het, even of all that went in at the gates of the city. Okay, now here you see that the children of Het are called Hittite, and these are the progenitors of what would become the Hittite Empire. Now, the Hittite Empire has been identified by modern archaeologists, for whatever this is worth, as having a capital near Ankara in Turkey called Hattusa. And there is evidence of this empire. And until they found Hattusa, this empire was considered mythological. And the Hittite Empire, not only did they find, of course, this Hattusa, but they also found evidence of an alphabet that appears to be a Phoenician alphabet. Now, what I mean by that is a Paleo-Ivrit-based alphabet, like the Etruscan alphabet and like the Colbran alphabet found in Wales. And that this was an early alphabet that they assigned to the Phoenicians, but the Phoenicians were really the northern kingdom of Yasharel, and they were the seafaring kingdom of Yasharel. Although I do believe that there were other tribes that were on the ships belonging to the house of Dan, in addition to Asher, Ephraim, Zebulun, Issachar, who were also on those ships. I think there was also Canaanites that may have been on those ships as well. And so when we see some of the tribal dispensation in the Great Lakes, that we see many of the house of Yasharel were on the Great Lakes, particularly the Iroquois nations were almost all from the house of Yasharel, but there were other nations that were in the Great Lakes as well that may have been Canaanite nations that had traveled with the so-called Phoenicians. This alphabet would then become the Greek Cyrillic alphabet, almost in a direct derivative, as compared to the Aramaic influences that would take over the Hebrew language in the Levant. Okay. Anyway, Ephron, well, even all that went into the gate of the city saying, Nay, my Adonai, verse 11, Nay, my Adonai, hear me. I give the field to you, and the cave that is therein, I give it to you in the presence of the sons of my people. give I it to you, bury your dead. And Abraham bowed down himself before the people of the land. And he spoke to Ephron in the audience of the people of the land, saying, but if you will give it, I pray, hear me. I will give you money for the field and take it from me, and I will bury my dead there. And Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, my Adonai, hear me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between me and you? Bury therefore those of yours who are dead. And Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed the silver to Ephron, which he had named in the audience of his sons of Het, 400 shekels of silver, current money with the merchant. All right, now this is an extremely important passage because we're seeing here again something that is affirmative in the life of Abraham. We saw it expressed when he met Melchizedek, in meeting Melchizedek, in saying, I'm not going to keep any of these spoils that I took from these kings in defeating them. I'm going to return them, and except for what my men are going to keep from the spoils of war. But I don't want anything. I don't want any of these things to belong to me at all. So you see, Abraham distinguishes himself and maintains his fierce independence from the people around him by making sure that the transactions are distant. And in this case, he says, you name the value, even surreptitiously name the value of this property. And then Abraham pays him the value without bartering, without bickering, without trying to bring the price down. He said 400 shekels of silver, and Abraham gives him 400 shekels of silver. Now, in addition to that, you can also see that the value of these shekels, or the value of real estate, is quite high. And the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, and the field and the cave which was therein, and all the trees that were in the field, that were in all the borders around it, were made sure. Okay, this is interesting because what you're talking about here is when you buy the real estate, you buy the land underneath the real estate, i.e. the cave. You buy everything that's on the real estate, i.e. the trees, and arguably you get the air above it. Okay, so all of this, the cave which was therein, all the trees that were in the field, and all the borders around it were made sure to Abraham for a possession in the presence of the children of Het before all that went in at the gate of the city. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah, his woman, in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre. The same is Hebron in the land of Canaan. And the field and the cave that is therein were made sure to Abraham for a possession of a burying place by the sons of Het. Okay, so that concludes our reading today of Genesis chapter 22 and chapter 23.